Welcome to my presentation on embryo storage. I just wanted to report a little bit on the storage itself, how it's used, what ends up happening when embryos get stored. Let's get started. An embryo, as many of us are familiar, is the start of a child. The medical dictionary, the HarperCollins medical dictionary, describes an embryo as an organism in the earliest stage of development in men or human race from the time of conception to the end of the second month in the uterus. This is what many of us might recognize an embryo as. This is actually at about 6 weeks. Generally, embryos are not stored at this stage of their development. Usually storage is a lot earlier on, in the earliest stages of development, as a matter of fact. So here's a chart from day 1 to day 5. Day 5 is what's called a blastocyst at that form of development, and that's actually the stage of the embryo where embryonic stem cells would be removed and used from an embryo. Now, we all know that there are different ways of conceiving a child. Obviously, there is a natural form of conception where the sperm and the egg are, the sperm fertilizes the egg. And then there's another form of conception called in vitro fertilization, and this is an artificial way to do things. It's where uh, basically a sperm fertilizes an egg within a petri dish, essentially in a lab. 1 in 6 couples in our country actually find issues with infertility, and approximately 1% of the babies born in the U.S. today are a result of in vitro fertilization, which is pretty astounding. Sometimes it takes a lot of tries, other times it takes just a single try to actually get the mother pregnant. There's different ways that embryos are used. First way is obviously in vitro fertilization, where there's difficulties with the woman conceiving naturally. This could also be due to old age or other complications, uh, fertility complications. There's always donating embryos to another person. Sometimes families will do this to other families who have issues affording the costs of in vitro fertilization, and maybe have their own infertility issues. Sometimes couples will be looking for specific genes. For example, like Caucasian comes from a well-educated couple, that kind of thing, and that's where we get into like the whole designer baby issue, which is a completely different topic. There's donating to research, which goes back into the medical industry and goes towards cures like Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes. These are all things that have a huge effect on the American public as far as our health is concerned. Um, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and diabetes are some of the top uh, causes of death in the United States, and so there's a lot of research going into fixing these kinds of things and curing them. Spinal disorders might be veterans who are paralyzed after combat, things like that. Those are issues that medical benefits could have a lot of control over someday, hopefully because of embryonic stem cell research. Storing embryos is another thing that happens to them after they're created. They're stored in tanks of liquid nitrogen, pictured here in the center. The prices for facilities to store embryos can be very different. A discussion among patients online suggested, just in their own situations, that sometimes they're as low as $600 per year. Sometimes they're upwards of $1,200 per year, depending on where. I've seen some reports of $2,000 or more per year, which is pretty high for a storage fee. If embryos never end up getting used, that's really where the moral dilemma comes in because just as kind of a natural result of the process, doctors will always try and get in touch with the patients or owners of the embryos so that they don't face any liability issues. But sometimes there's really no decision or direction given by the parents. They're not always able to reach them. Sometimes the parents can't afford the storage anymore. And I say parents, I should say patients or owners of the embryos. They can't always afford the storage anymore. Um, so the American Society of Reproductive Medicine has given guidelines, keyword guidelines, no policies, no regulations. They've said that if the embryos have been really abandoned, if there's no contact for more than 5 years, and if there has not been any previous instruction, clinics actually have the go-ahead to destroy them. Again, that's not a regulation or a policy, though. Doctors really have the final say in their own clinics what they're going to be doing. They have to weigh their options based on the storage space they have available versus what they're already using, the cost of storing in their own facilities, um, and then the demands of the patients that they have, maybe projections of storage demands in the future. These are all things that they'd have to consider um, really just logistically. There was a study done by University of Pennsylvania that surveyed 208 clinics, and the results showed that 84% of these 208 clinics actually practice disposing or destroying embryos. And when they destroy the embryos, it's considered biological waste, and that's kind of the method that they use for destroying them. As far as not destroying them goes, others might donate them to research, which kind of places them back into the circle of life, so to speak, and kind of gives them a purpose other than a potential child. Still, other clinics who don't destroy them might just keep them in storage indefinitely, really just in the hopes that policies or regulations might come out, or in the hopes that parents might give them a little bit more direction. Um, Obviously, there is a big lack of policy and regulation. This is something that people have discussed as the government getting involved, if it's necessary for the government to step in and create regulations, or if this is something that only the medical field can really approach on a case-by-case basis, or maybe even at a uh, clinic level, having the doctors continue to make their own policies based on what they prefer, what their beliefs are. A lot of religion can tie into their decisions, and it's really just dependent on what the doctors think for their own situations.